There are things a woman only dares to remember when her hands begin to wrinkle, and the mirror no longer hides what life has done to her. I'm 70 now. It's strange how memories change shape as you grow older. What once felt like facts become whispers, and whispers become echoes. I've carried a story in silence for most of my life. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. Not even myself. I was born in 1955, in a small town in Kentucky, in a wooden house where the floors creaked like old bones, and the wind slipped through the cracks as if trying to listen in. My mother, Margaret, was a woman made of iron and prayers. She raised me alone, with a worn Bible, a sharp tongue, and a photograph of a man she never spoke about. That man was my father. His name was Harold Vincent. I used to stare at his picture, a black and white photo of a soldier, stiff and tall, with deep-set eyes that seemed to look past the camera. Mama told me he'd gone missing during a flood when I was just 3. "The river took him," she'd say, her voice flat. "No body. No goodbyes." As a child, I accepted it. Children believe what they're told, until the silence around the story becomes louder than the story itself. There were no belongings of his in the house. No letters, no clothes, no wedding ring. Just that photograph hanging above the kitchen sink, crooked as if it refused to hang straight. I once asked Mama why we didn't have anything else of his. She looked at me hard and said, "Because men like that leave nothing behind." That was all. I learned not to ask again. But the absence of my father was a shadow in every room. When I graduated from school and no one clapped loudest. When I danced at church socials and no one warned the boys away. When I got my first job at the diner and came home to Mama's tired eyes. It was always there. The shape of what was missing. Then when I was 16, a man walked into our lives, and everything changed. His name was Robert Blake. He had moved back to town after years up north, working in construction and business. Though no one ever said exactly what kind of business, he had a way of dressing that made him stand out. Always neat, always pressed, with cologne that smelled expensive. Mama met him through the church bazaar. She was helping set up the bake sale. He was donating a check. I watched her laugh that day. Not the soft kind of laugh I remembered from bedtime stories, but a strange, girlish giggle that made my stomach twist. Robert was charming, polite, helpful. He started coming by more often, always with a reason. A box of peaches, a broken fence he could fix, a book he thought Mama might enjoy. I was 17 when he started bringing me things, too. Nothing improper. A scarf, a book of poems, a bracelet, compliments that made Mama beam. By the time I turned 18, the town had started talking. A few people wondered if he was courting both of us. But this was the South. People didn't meddle, unless there was a scandal. And Mama made sure there wasn't one. She stepped back, smiled at our wedding, and moved into the smaller room after I moved in with Robert. Yes, I married him. I married the man who made my mother laugh again. The man who looked at me with soft eyes and called me his little dove. At the time, I thought it was the beginning of my life. I was wrong. Robert had money. Not the kind you see in mansions or convertibles, but the quiet kind. A nice car, a bigger house on the hill, a refrigerator that hummed instead of clanked. He built a home for me, and in that home I was expected to be a wife. Just a wife. No college, no job. I kept house. I baked. I sewed. I decorated for the holidays. I smiled when his friends came over, and I didn't ask about the locked study upstairs. He never hit me, never raised his voice. But there was something in him that made me shrink, a silence, a distance. Some nights I'd wake and find him staring out the window, drinking whiskey, whispering to himself. He'd say names, not often, but sometimes. I once heard the name Harold. I thought it was a coincidence. I clung to the idea that I had built something real, that my life, quiet and clean and controlled, was better than Mama's. But I was lonely. So lonely it ached. We never had children. Robert said it wasn't the right time. Said we should wait. Said the world was no place for a baby. And I believed him. Because what else could I do? My mother died in 1983, and with her went the last questions I didn't dare ask. Or so I thought. She left me only one thing. A box. Small. Wooden. Locked. I found it under her bed, wrapped in one of her old shawls. I didn't open it. Not at first. I told myself it wasn't mine to open, that some secrets should stay buried. But the box called to me. Years passed. The world changed. I grew older. Robert grew colder. And then, one night, years after Mama died. Robert cried out in his sleep. I had never heard him scream before. He shouted a name, clear as a bell, like a man at the gallows. Harold Vincent! I sat up, heart pounding. I touched his shoulder. He didn't wake. But I did. That moment, that terrible moment, cracked something open in me. I knew, with the certainty of a child recognizing her mother's scent, that Robert knew my father. And not just knew him. He had done something to him. The next morning, I opened the box, and inside I found the first piece of the truth. Sometimes the dead speak louder through paper than they ever did with breath. The box was smaller than I remembered. A pale wood, almost the color of my skin now, with a brass latch that had dulled over time. My hands trembled as I opened it. Not because I expected anything, but because part of me hoped there was still nothing inside. I had spent decades believing silence was safer. But inside the box, beneath a folded handkerchief and an old church bulletin, was a collection of letters tied together with a navy blue ribbon. Letters addressed to my mother. From Harold. The first was dated March 12th, 1957, 2 years after he had supposedly disappeared. The handwriting was unmistakably male, confident, but urgent, like someone writing in a hurry. The first words hit me like cold water. Margaret, I'm still alive, and I need your help. I dropped the letter. The room spun. That voice I had only imagined from stories, from the picture on the wall, suddenly felt alive in my hands. He wasn't dead. He hadn't drowned. He had written to her, pleaded with her. I read the letters through tears. There were 10 in total. The last one was written in early 1959. The story they told was not clean or simple. Harold hadn't died in the flood. He had been working a late shift at the mill when he overheard a conversation he was never meant to hear. Something about stolen money. Something about names. Local names. Powerful ones. Robert Blake was one of them. At the time, Robert was just a foreman, not yet wealthy, not yet polished, but connected, dangerous. Harold tried to speak out. The night he was going to report what he'd discovered, he disappeared. Except he didn't. He escaped. He fled the town, fearing for his life. He sent letters from out of state, trying to convince my mother to come meet him, to bring me. He begged her, but she never replied. Not once. I sat on the floor for hours that morning, rereading every letter, searching for something more. Some explanation. Some sign that she tried. But there was nothing. Just silence. Again. Why hadn't she told me? Why hadn't she left with him? Had Robert threatened her? Or had she chosen him? I didn't know what hurt more. That my father had lived and tried to come back for me, or that my mother never let him. By the time I stood up, something had shifted in me. I was no longer the quiet wife. I was the daughter of a man who had been hunted, hidden, and erased, and I was living with the man who might have helped bury him. I didn't confront Robert, not right away. You don't corner a man like that without knowing what he's capable of. Instead, I started watching, listening. I paid attention to the things I had spent my life ignoring. I noticed the drawer he always locked in his study, the calls he took only in the garage, the way he flinched whenever I mentioned my mother's name. Then came the newspaper clippings. I found them by accident, tucked in the back of his bookshelf, behind a row of mystery novels. They were yellowed with age, old stories about the mill, about the workers' strike, about the fire that broke out in 1958 and destroyed the southern warehouse. There was one clipping circled in red ink. Local man missing after attempted theft at Vincent Mill. Vincent, that was my father's name. The article didn't mention him directly, but I knew. I felt it. This was the cover-up, the official lie, and Robert had kept it. Why? Guilt? Pride? Or fear that someday someone would find out? I made copies, hid them in my sewing box, under layers of fabric no man would ever touch. I was careful. I waited. Until the night came when Robert fell ill. A heart issue. Nothing dramatic, but enough to put him in the hospital for a few days. And that gave me time. Time to go digging. I found the key to his locked drawer taped under the edge of his desk. Inside were documents, receipts, letters, names. One envelope with my father's name on it, another with mine, and one I wasn't prepared for. A photograph, taken in 1960. A blurry image of a man with a beard and sad eyes, standing outside a gas station in Arkansas. On the back, scribbled in my mother's handwriting, "He found us. Don't bring her." My knees gave out. They had met. She had seen him, alive, and she had turned him away. I don't remember how long I sat there. The house was too quiet, the clock ticking too loudly. I could hear my breath, shallow, angry. I wasn't sure who I hated more in that moment. My mother for choosing silence, or Robert for making it necessary. When Robert came home from the hospital, I kissed his cheek and made him soup. I told him I was glad he was back. He smiled, tired and pale, and said, "You've always been my blessing, Mary." I smiled back, but something inside me had gone cold. I no longer felt like his wife. I felt like a witness, and a woman who owed her father the truth. Sometimes justice doesn't come with sirens or courtrooms. Sometimes it walks into the room with a pie and a steady gaze. After Robert came home from the hospital, he moved slower, breathed heavier, but carried himself like the same man, the one who ran our house with silence and gestures, not words. He never asked what I did while he was away. Men like him never suspect women like me. Not because we're invisible, but because they never bothered to look deeper. And I used that. You see, I wasn't raised for war. I was raised to keep things tidy, to say, "Yes, sir," and to let men decide what was worth knowing. But there's a particular strength that only women who've been silenced their whole lives can carry. A strength born not of muscle, but of memory. A strength that sharpens when you've been told one too many times to sit down and smile. So I smiled. I made his coffee just the way he liked. I read to him from the newspaper when his eyes tired. I laughed softly when he made the same tired jokes he'd told for 20 years. I kissed his forehead at night, and every day I wrote. I wrote everything down. Every document I found, every letter, every suspicious name mentioned in his drawer. I copied it all by hand. I couldn't risk anyone seeing me at the copier at the library. Not in a town like ours, where secrets float on front porches and gossip spreads faster than wildfire. Then I mailed them. To myself. Every week, a manila envelope with my own handwriting returned to our mailbox. I stored them in an old shoebox in the attic, hidden under Christmas decorations no one touched since 1989. I also started talking to people. Gently. There was a man named Jesse Thomas who used to work with my father at the mill. He lived alone, kept to himself, but still came to church on the first Sunday of each month. I asked if he remembered Harold. He looked at me for a long time before answering. His eyes softened. "He was a good man," Jesse said. "Too honest. For his own good." That was it. But it was enough. Enough to know I wasn't imagining things. Enough to keep going. Then came the second discovery. I was organizing Robert's pillbox one evening, when a scrap of paper fell out from the folds of his wallet. A phone number. Nothing more. Just digits written in ink that had started to smudge. I called it from the payphone behind the gas station. A woman answered. Her voice was clipped, cautious. I asked for Robert. Long pause. Then she asked, "Who is this?" I told her I was his wife. Another pause. Then, "He told me you were dead." I hung up. My hands shook. My legs turned to jelly. I sat on the curb and stared at the dust rising from the road, feeling like my world had spun sideways again. There was another woman, and clearly, another life. Robert Blake, my husband of over 40 years, had told someone else I was dead. Was it a mistress? A daughter? A second wife? I didn't know. But now, the man I thought I knew was no longer just a suspect in my father's disappearance. He was a stranger wearing my husband's skin. And suddenly, I was afraid. Not for my life. That part of me had already died a long time ago. But afraid of what I would find if I kept going. I started recording our conversations. Small ones, harmless ones, tucked into quiet dinners and porch talks. Not because he was confessing. Robert was too clever for that. But I wanted to catch the slips, the inconsistencies, the way he spoke about the past like it was someone else's life. "Remember the fire at the old mill?" I asked one evening as we sat watching the sun bleed into the trees. He didn't blink. "What fire?" "The one in 58, where a man went missing." Still no reaction. "Don't remember," he said, sipping his bourbon. "Things like that happen. People disappear." "Disappear!" It was the way he said it. Flat, clean, like brushing dust off his coat. That night I went into his study after he slept. I opened the bottom drawer again. There, beneath a stack of financial statements, was a second photo. This one showed Robert and a man I didn't recognize, standing in front of a truck. The man beside him had a bandaged hand and a look in his eyes like he didn't sleep well. Scrawled on the back, March 59, after the job. The job. A euphemism if I'd ever heard one. The same year my father's letters stopped. I stared at the photo until my vision blurred. I wasn't just Robert's wife anymore. I was the daughter of a missing man, and I had evidence. But what do you do with evidence when the crime was buried under 40 years of church suppers and neighborhood barbecues? Who do you tell when your entire life was built on a lie? I went to Pastor Daniels. He had baptized our niece, buried my mother, and married us all those years ago. He listened. He took my hands in his and said, "Mary, if what you're saying is true, then God has waited long for the truth to find you." He offered to help me speak to someone at the sheriff's office, quietly, off the record. But I didn't want silence anymore. I wanted it loud. On June 12th of that year, I took the envelope filled with the copied letters, photos, and newspaper clippings, and I walked into the sheriff's office. I asked for a detective, I said, "My father disappeared in 1957. I believe my husband knows what happened to him." They didn't laugh. They didn't roll their eyes. They took the envelope and asked me to sit. For the first time in my life, I was not a daughter, not a wife. I was a woman. Speaking the truth. Justice doesn't always wear a robe or swing a gavel. Sometimes it shows up in the form of a tired woman holding a shoebox full of forgotten things. They took me seriously. I hadn't expected that. Maybe it was the way I stood there. Not with fire in my voice, but with 40 years of silence behind me. Maybe it was the fact that I had dates and documents, not just suspicions. Or maybe the detective, a young woman named Clarissa White, saw something in my eyes that she recognized in herself. Her refusal to be ignored. She asked for copies of everything. The letters, the photographs, the newspaper clippings. And she asked me to tell the story, from the beginning. So I did. I sat in that interview room for hours, recounting not just facts, but feelings, the moments I ignored, the nights I spent wondering, the sound of Robert whispering my father's name in his sleep, the second life, the hidden drawer, the photograph with "after the job" scribbled on the back. Detective White didn't say much. She just nodded, took notes, and asked the kind of questions that didn't feel like prying. Just untangling. When I finished, she said, "We're going to look into this. I promise." I wanted to believe her, but I'd lived a life where promises meant very little. Robert noticed the change in me. I started taking walks alone. I stayed longer at the store. I went to church more often, and stayed late to help clean. I think he assumed I was just restless. After all, I'd been his for so long. Who would believe I had secrets of my own? Then one morning I returned from the market and found him standing in the doorway with one of my envelopes in his hand. The return address had torn partially. He saw my handwriting. "Why are you sending things to yourself?" he asked. I froze. My mouth was dry. My fingers went cold. I told him I was journaling, sending pieces of a memoir to myself so I could later organize them. A lie, but not a stupid one. Robert stared at me for a long time. Then he smiled. "That's cute," he said. "Always thought you had stories in you." He let it go. But I knew then. He was watching, and I had to move faster. Detective White came to my house 2 weeks later. She didn't wear a uniform, just a plain blue blouse, a soft face, and eyes that didn't judge. She asked if we could talk somewhere private. I offered her the porch. She told me they'd found something. A police report from 1959, sealed and buried deep in the archives. It mentioned my father. Not by name, but by description. A man matching his profile had been stopped on a country road late one night, miles from town. He had no ID, no car. Just a torn photograph of a baby girl in his pocket. Me. The officer didn't arrest him. But the next day, the report said he vanished again. And that officer, he died in a house fire the following year. Too many coincidences. Too many ghosts. Detective White said, "I need you to be prepared, Mary. We might not find a body. We might never get a conviction. But we can bring him in for questioning. Do you want that?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at my hands. Old hands, wrinkled hands. Hands that had washed dishes and buried parents and held too many secrets. "Yes," I said finally. "I want to hear what he says when someone else is listening." The day they brought Robert in, I wasn't there. They called it a conversation, not an arrest. He returned home with a scowl on his face and whiskey on his breath. He didn't speak to me for days. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I was done shrinking. I spent those days packing things. Not to run, not to hide, but to prepare. Because the walls were closing in, and I wanted to be the one holding the match when they burned. Then, it happened. Robert suffered a second heart attack. This one worse. The ambulance came. They took him to the hospital. I followed. Not out of love, but out of duty. A final act of closure. He was awake when I got there. Hooked to tubes. Pale. Angry. He asked me why I did it, I said. Because Harold was my father. He didn't flinch. Just looked away and muttered, "He shouldn't have come back." And that was it. A confession. Not for the police, not for a tape recorder, just for me. And it was enough, because I finally knew. He died 3 days later. No trial, no jail, no justice the way I had imagined, but also no more lies, no more silence. And that, in the end, was justice enough. The sheriff's office closed the case with no conclusive evidence, but Detective White filed a final report that included my testimony, the documents, and the context. It was added to the public record. My father's name, once erased, was now preserved. His story wasn't just mine to carry anymore. At 70, I learned the truth. At 71, I began to live again. I moved to a small house closer to my niece. I planted a garden. I took up quilting, and every Wednesday I visit the cemetery where I placed a simple plaque beside my mother's grave. Harold Vincent, 1929. A good man, a lost father, not forgotten. They say time heals all wounds, but some wounds don't want to be healed. They just want to be named. People started treating me differently after Robert passed. Some came with casseroles, speaking softly, unsure if I was mourning or relieved. Others kept their distance, as if widowhood were contagious, especially the scandalous kind. A few, mostly the old ones who had known Robert back when, looked at me like they had always known, but chose not to say it. That's the thing about small towns. Everyone knows something, but few know what to do with the truth once it's out in the open. I didn't try to explain myself. I had no interest in clearing my name or rebuilding my image. I had lived too long for that. Instead, I wrote. Not just in letters to myself this time, but in pages. I filled notebooks. I wrote down the story of Harold, of Robert, of Margaret, of Mary, me. I wrote for the little girl who used to press her fingers against the photo above the sink. For the woman who married too young and trusted too deeply. For the mother I never became. For the father I never got to bury. It became a habit. Mornings with coffee. Afternoons with the soft tapping of my pen. Evenings by the window, watching the sunset and scribbling final thoughts. It wasn't for publishing. It was for remembering. And for forgiving. Not them, but myself. My niece Caroline came to visit one weekend. She brought her son, a bright boy with freckles and questions I wasn't ready for. He asked me, "Grandma Mary, where did your daddy go?" I paused. Then for the first time in my life I told a child the truth. He went somewhere people couldn't find him, and someone made sure he stayed there. But I looked for him, even when I was very old, and I found what I could. He nodded satisfied and ran off to play. Children don't need the details. They need the dignity of a story that makes sense in their hearts. I didn't plan to speak at Robert's funeral, but when I stood there, in the pew, staring at the back of too many heads who once called me Mrs. Blake, I felt something rise in me. I walked up to the front, placed a single lily on his closed casket and said, "We all carry secrets. Some of us carry more than our share. I pray he found peace. And I pray for everyone, still waiting for truth to find them." That was all. The pastor nodded. The congregation murmured, and I walked away. Now I live in a home with quiet corners and soft light. I hang my father's photograph beside my own. I planted a tree in the backyard, a weeping willow, for the tears we never shed. I sometimes talk to him when I water the flowers, tell him about the world he never saw, the life I lived, the man I lost, and the man I escaped. I don't feel haunted anymore, just hollow in places. And that's okay, because not every space must be filled. Some spaces must remain empty to remind us of what was lost and what could have been. If you're reading this someday, if you're holding these words and wondering if you should keep digging for the truth, I want to tell you something. Do it, even if it hurts, especially if it hurts, because healing doesn't come from pretending it didn't happen. It comes from naming what did. I'm 73 now. I still write every morning. But now, I also smile when I wake. Because I know who I am. Not just a widow, not just a daughter, but a witness, a survivor, and a woman who, even if too late, found her way to the truth. Sweetheart, if you made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. It means more than you know. Now tell me, where are you watching from? Leave me a little note in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you can hear more. Stories like mine, we all carry something. And maybe your story deserves to be heard too.